Hey everyone, I'm excited to share my ultralight no compromise Brompton. This won't be an in-depth step-by-step build video, but I'll go over some of my part choices, problems I faced during the build, and other things to look out for if you want to build something similar or upgrade your Brompton. So the reason I built this bike, I only wanted one bike for everything with no compromises. This means super lightweight, super wide gear range, a rack, and roller wheels. I use this bike for groceries, leisure rides around town, bike packing, travel, pretty much everything. I think the only thing this bike will have trouble tackling is very rough dirt or gravel roads. I also live in a second floor flat without a lot of room for other bikes, so I don't really want to have a full-size bike take up more room. Plus I already have a problem buying upgrades for my Brompton, so having another bike to upgrade would not be great for my wallet. I had a loose goal in mind of aiming for the same weight as the T-Line at half the price. I ended up going a bit over budget, but also below the T-Line weight. My build pretty much uses parts from AliExpress, which is why I named my bike Ali. I know there are tons of fancy builds out there with very expensive parts, but I've always been the type of person to try cheap first and upgrade as necessary. You can potentially get good parts for a lot less, and often there isn't much of a compromise. Anyways, let's get on with a look at the general specifications. The weight of the bike is 8.12 kilograms. I recently got to use a Park Tool scale, so I will consider this the official weight. The weight of my bike with my everyday carry is 8.59 kilograms. This includes my frame rack, handlebar, pouch, bike lights, pump, and toolkit. The cost ended up being around £2,750. Part prices fluctuate, but this is probably accurate as of the end of 2024, give or take £100 or so. I've also linked a spreadsheet in the video description of the parts and vendors I use. So the current build has a gear range of 468%, from 21.2 gear inches to 99.3 gear inches. I'll put a chart up here to compare it to Brompton's standard gearing options. With the 12-speed hub, it was possible to add an extra sprocket, so my setup is actually a 15-speed with 5 sprockets on the cassette and 3 speeds in the internal gear hub. The cassette is 11, 13, 15, 18, and 21 teeth. I just bought 11 speed sprockets separately with the right spacers to make my own cassette. Also note that the 21 tooth is about the limit of the derailleur. You might get it with 22, but the jockey wheel of the derailleur gets very close to the sprocket and it won't work properly. You can get derailleur extenders or different derailleurs that allow for a bigger sprocket. My current front chainring is 42 tooth. I'm mostly in the second gear for the internal gear hub for regular city riding, and I usually shift the internal gear hub to 1 when I'm starting from a standstill, or 3 when I want to go faster or when I'm going downhill. This means the gear overlap does not really bother me. And yeah, next up, frame. So I'll save the debate on the ethical or moral issues of buying a third-party frame for another video. But yes, this is a third-party full titanium frame. I do like the term Brompton, but it's just awkward to say to a layperson. I was originally going to get a P-line and modify it, but I didn't like any of the frame colors. Then I considered getting a secondhand metallic gray C-line. It has a nice matte dark gray finish to match the sandblasted titanium fork and triangle. I personally like my bike to be more low-key, but that frame was hard to find since it was only available for 2022. I finally decided to just get a full titanium frame after just weighing the costs and potential part wear of buying a secondhand frame. The AliExpress vendor I went with was Bona TI Store. Bona TI Store? I've bought triangles, forks, and stems from them before, and the parts and communication are pretty good. If you've been in forums and Facebook groups, you've no doubt heard about frame flex on these titanium frames. I read a lot about it, but most people don't specify their weight. I'm relatively lightweight at around 68 kilograms, so it wasn't a huge concern for me. I still went with the thicker 2mm tube profile just in case, and the weight difference was negligible. I'm also using an M titanium stem with a flat bar for a more aero riding position. I do recommend a version with a fully removable handlebar clamp instead of the single bolt design. A single bolt design is a total pain to get curved bars in, and you'll definitely scratch your handlebars. One other issue I had was the rear P-line style triangle did not come with the internal gear hub pulley wheel mount. I think it's because this was before the 12-speed hub came out, so the Chinese frame builders just left it out thinking it was redundant. I had to design a 3D printed part to hold the pulley wheel mechanism in place, and it's worked great. If you're buying a P-line rear triangle, definitely ask the seller to confirm if it has it. Onto the brakes. After playing around with cheap aftermarket brakes from Light Pro, Acefix, ZTTO, I found that none actually stopped as well as the standard Brompton brakes. I can make a video in the future about the different brake calipers I've tried if there's interest, but I don't think I have the time or patience to actually swap the brakes on a bike and do back-to-back testing. The second best brakes were the Acefix ones on my wife's Brompton, but these Light Pro ones are okay. The main stopping power comes from the front disc brakes anyway, so I was not too fussed about the rear. I saw this titanium disc brake fork with 74mm OLD, which allowed me to keep the same fold, and I was pretty set on using it for this build. From my research, it wouldn't really add much more weight, and braking performance would definitely be better than third-party and potentially standard Brompton brakes. Not to mention the benefit of not having to worry about overheating the rims and blowing out tubes on a long descent. Since I wanted the new 12-speed internal gear hub for the rear, I didn't do rear disc brakes. Very happy with the stopping power from the front disc brakes and the rear standard brakes. I'm also using the standard pads that came with the ZTTO calipers and a set of ultralight disc brakes, so there's definitely room to optimize braking performance. I already have a set of hydraulic brakes I want to try out. The setup would end up weighing about the same as the hybrid brakes I have now, but the mismatched brake levers might bother me too much. Also, some of you might have noticed that the calipers are mounted backwards, meaning that when braking, the forces pull the caliper away from the fork instead of pushing the caliper into the fork. This means that the caliper heavily relies on the two mounting bolts to keep everything together. I think this is the sketchiest part of the build, and I should really swap the random bolts that came with the brake calipers to titanium ones. But I just recently found front forks that are made of carbon and aluminum alloy that apparently mount the correct way, so I'm going to try those, and hopefully the brakes don't interfere with the fold, because I think that's the main reason why they put the mount on the other side in the first place. There was one issue with the forks. There was brake rub, and no amount of adjustment would fix it. I think there was a misalignment on the bolt mounts on the fork, and what I had to do is print some spacers for the disc brake caliper, and I also had to add a spacer on the disc brake itself. The seller Bona TI tried to help, but I think it's just such a low sale item that, I don't know, I guess they couldn't figure it out or tried to shift the blame. But anyways, it's definitely some issues like this that you might encounter, which is why it's hard to recommend a build like this unless you're really willing to tinker with stuff. So moving on to the wheels, the rear is boring and it's just a standard Brompton 12-speed hub. The rear wheel along with the derailleur is the only Brompton thing on this bike, and as mentioned I might change out the derailleur in the future. The front wheels is a Silverrock 6-bolt disc brake 74mm OLD wheel. It's actually pretty light at 493 grams and only costs 111 pounds. I think the mismatched wheels could bother some people, but I don't really care, plus they're both black rims, so not really that noticeable. Next up, cranks. I recently changed my cranks to these 162.5 length carbon cranks from Rock Bros. The logo is super obnoxious and I might send it off in the future. But the crazy thing is they only weigh 323 grams. Not too bad compared to the THM Clavicula, which costs about 1,300 pounds and only weighs about 30 grams less. But to be fair, the THM does include the spider and bragging rights, so I mainly wanted to try a shorter crank with bigger difference from 170 to see if there's a noticeable difference. So far, I think the smaller circumference pedal strokes does feel quite nice for normal riding I've been doing. I didn't notice any knee or hip pain before from 100-kilometer rides, but I do plan to do even longer rides, so maybe this will help with those. In theory, I think it makes sense, especially if you're shorter, because your leg at the upper portion of the pedal stroke doesn't need to come up as far. Anyway, the bike fit is a complicated subject and I'm far from an expert. Also, these cranks are 72mm wide, so you'll need spacers for the bottom bracket, but the bottom bracket usually comes with spacers. It uses a 22mm SRAM dub axle standard, so you'll need a BSA bottom bracket that fits that axle diameter. If you're a bike nerd, you might know that some people don't like the idea of using 29mm axles in the standard BSA bottom bracket because the bearings are undersized. We'll see how it lasts long term, but so far no issues, and honestly bottom brackets are not that expensive or hard to replace. These cranks use an Easton cinch chainring mount, which is annoyingly rare. I didn't consider how hard they were to find when I ordered it. You can also buy a spider adapter that allows you to mount more normal 4 and 5 bolt chain rings. Next, seat post and saddle. I've tried several carbon seat posts now. While they do wear out faster than metal ones, I think it's still worth it. You can mitigate wear by cleaning the seat post sleeve more often. Also, I've started 3D printing my own seat post sleeves now, so I can really dial in the fit of the seat post sleeve to the seat post itself. They're also easily removable, so it makes it easier to clean. The carbon seat post I have weighs 197 grams and costs 34 pounds. As a comparison, the standard steel seat post and pentaclip is around 490 grams. The saddle comes in at a whopping 62 grams and costs 89 pounds. Luckily for me, this saddle fits me great. I can easily do 40-kilometer rides with no bib shorts and no discomfort. Saddles are a very personal thing, but I've tried heavy and light Bork saddles, cheap 3D printed saddles, and this one was honestly one of the most comfortable. Moving on to shifters. This is where I don't think I have everything figured out yet. and it could use a bit more tuning. For the 5-speed in the back, I currently use a Union Jack 7-speed shifter. The spacing seems to work well enough, just that the top and bottom shifts don't do anything on the shifter mechanism. The shifting isn't super crisp, and it might be down to the sprocket setup. I've heard that the spacing between sprockets can vary depending on which area of the cassette, so I might try to mess around with that a bit more. It could also be the gear cable. I'm just using an AliExpress ripoff of the Jaguar link cables. I'm also thinking about switching back to regular cables for shifting to see if it's any better. The link cables are good weight savings for the brake cables and act as compressionless housing when set up properly, but the weight savings aren't as significant for the shifter cable, so it might be easier and better to just go with the simple stuff. For the internal gear hub shifter, I'm using a DT Swiss shifter made for shocks. The pull ratio works great for the internal gear hub. It's really well made and super light. One tweak I had to do was 3D print an adapter so that the shifter cable can better align to the shifter. I could have stuck with the stock shifters and used the Brommy Plus internals for the 5-speed, but the stock shifters aren't great quality and heavier, so I just went aftermarket. Let's take a look at the rack and roller wheels next. I made this rack after seeing this YouTube video. I was already leaning towards something custom, but when I saw this video pop up, it was perfect. For the most part, it's worked great. I don't think it's as robust as it could be, and I'm planning to take this on a couple flights, so we'll see how they hold up. The original maker just used it as a pannier rack, but since I also roll my Brompton around on the rack, the stresses are a bit different. It could be that the epoxy I'm using isn't strong enough, but the fittings have come loose once already. It's still a work in progress, but it's super light at around 100 grams. The fender's also held by the rack as well, so the entire setup is quite light. I designed and 3D printed the roller wheels. I wasn't happy with the aftermarket ones out there because they were either too heavy or the tires were too thin and would wear out and are hard to replace. I decided to make my own wheels, which are completely user serviceable, plus they only weigh about 25 grams per wheel with the titanium bolt. I think I covered most of the major things on this build. If you want any details on any specific part of the build, let me know and I can make some follow-up videos since this is getting long already. There were a lot of things to work out through this build, and my 3D design and 3D printing skills definitely came in handy. I'm not sure I could recommend this exact build unless you're willing to do your own experimentation. I also want to make some videos for budget lightweight builds that work off of a standard Brompton frame. What do you guys think? What's your dream setup? Anything you want further details on? Let me know in the comments. Thanks.